So we start now the third panel that's going to be chaired by James Green, who is Carlos Manuel de Céspedes Professor of Latin American History, Director of Brown's Brazil Initiative, Distinguished Visiting Professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and the Executive Director of the Brazilian Studies Association, BRASA, which will be housed at the Watson Institute from 2015 to 2020. He's the author of, among other books, Beyond Carnival, Male Homosexuality in 20th Century Brazil, and We Cannot Remain Silent, Opposition to the Brazilian Military Dictatorship in the United States. He's currently completing a biography of Herbert Daniel, a Brazilian evolutionary and AIDS activist. Thank you, Jim, for sharing the panel, and to Brigitte and Gustavo, who Jim is going to introduce.
Brazilian revolutionary, not evolutionary. That's interesting. That's right. I must have made a mistake when I sent that. I'm very honored to be invited to participate in this conference by colleagues at Brown University who are very dear to me, and so it's really nice to have been asked to talk about something I know nothing about. So there's a lot of confidence in there that I'm going to make some comments at the end of our panel. But I'm honored to introduce two speakers. I'm going to introduce both of them. And then I believe Brigitte is going to speak first, but I'm going to introduce them both right now. Brigitte Batiste is a biologist by training and with research experience in Amazon fishing ecology and an MA at the University of Florida in Latin American Studies, working with forest management by Andean peasants. She has worked for a decade as a landscape ecologist, teaching at the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Rural Development at the Javeriana Universidad de Bogotá, with further studies in her PhD in environmental science at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, and as appointed the General Director of the Instituto it's German, so how do you do that? Von Humboldt 6 years ago, and currently enjoys a time for thought at the University of Columbia, not Colombia, as a visiting scholar at the Earth Institute while keeping duties at MEP as a member of the IPBES. So we're very honored to have you here with us today. And Gustavo Procopio Furtado, that was a Spanish accent for a Brazilian, that was weird, okay, is an assistant professor of Romance Studies, Brazilian and Global Portuguese Studies, and Arts of the Moving Image at Duke University. His articles have appeared in the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies and in an anthology, Latin American Documentary Films in the New Millennium, Palgrave, 2016, and he is currently finishing a book-length manuscript on contemporary Brazilian documentary filmmaking titled Archives of the Living Present, Documentary Filmmaking in Contemporary Brazil. And I'm going to ask both of you to speak no more than 30 minutes, if not a little less, so that we have time for short comments by me and debate before finishing at 5 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here this afternoon. I am not a scholar by myself. Nowadays, I'm more part of the, as just mentioned, as IPBES, which is the global platform for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And what I am bringing here is a set of talks on the basis of the discussion that is ongoing those days to include all types of knowledge within the task of the platform. The platform was created 3.5 years ago. It's a global platform, such as the IPCC. You all know the IPCC. So that's the same kind of institution. It's the for biodiversity. And I assembled some of the questions that we are dealing with in our task force for ILK. ILK meaning Indigenous and Local Knowledge. We are plenty of acronyms, which is, but that's the way international institutions have to go. And so I think that the most tricky question we have to really get many knowledge systems into our task is the question of scale. How do you provide a bridge for local communities, local systems of knowledge, or different systems of knowledge that have roots in a particular type of, or in a particular way of thinking, which is not just in terms of spatial thinking, but also in terms of ways of thinking. So that's why title. And let's see. Yeah. So the question that we are really discussing is how to get those systems of knowledge engaged into the task of IPBES. So I have to explain the task is divided in 4 types of things. The first one is to generate new knowledge, but not to go to the field to generate that knowledge, but to coordinate, to promote a new type of knowledge that is useful at the global scale for decisions on the protection of biodiversity, the protection of the functions of the ecosystems, for the purposes of culture, of social well-being. The second dimension is that IPBES has tasks from the governments, special tasks that the governments bring to the platform, such as, okay, how are the pollinators of the world behaving right now? What's the status of the pollinators? Because pollinators are very important for agriculture, for economy, and for whatever reason. So governments bring that kind of questions. What's the status of sustainable use of wildlife? And what do we have to do to protect livelihoods that depend on sustainable use of wildlife? Or what is the future of wildlife in the middle of systems of use? Then, and accordingly, we have to provide new policy, recommendations to the society, to the private sector, to the communities, in general terms, to all the members of the platform. Okay, we have studied and we now have a document on pollination, and so we recommend this and this and this. And the last one, but not least, of course, is the build-up of capacities within the countries, within the society. How do we deal with pollination and sustainable use, or whatever are the issues? So the challenge to accomplish this task is really big. The platform by itself works as an annual meeting of countries. Usually 130 countries participate in a week of work in some place in the world, and has a couple of themes, one for policy or political issues, and one for technical issues, and that's the acronym of MEP that was mentioned at the beginning. The MEP is the multi-stake holder expert panel. That means 25 persons from all around the world that foresee the agenda of the IPBES. And this agenda has the task to assemble recommendations for including those systems of knowledge, and I got the chance to oversee that task force for the last year. So here is some of the questions that have been discussed within that task, and I'm happy to say that all the 4 previous lectures have really touched deep on what are felt within the team, but I am uncertain in how this can be really used for the purposes of the IPBES, but perhaps you have some words on that. And well, I mentioned that that's a big challenge, but also the point of departure is that we really acknowledge a multidimensional world, that this is a world where there's plenty of systems of knowledge, there's a world plenty of differences and epistemologies and even ontologies. and therefore it's quite complicated to try to assemble something for everybody that fits for all countries, all governments, all organizations, that is and it's worthwhile also, the task of the IPBES. And there's the sense in some parts of the IPBES that we need to build some scientific common ground for everybody, like saying, can we reach an agreement on the big trends of ecosystem destruction, on biodiversity extinction, and the processes that are involved or are behind that, or maybe we choose to go for a very political negotiation without the need of such agreement or of such a general scientific or knowledge-based basis. And this is hard talks in the platform, and especially because the platform was created by the natural scientist community of the world, which is very worried that decisions on fisheries worldwide, on forestry, on agriculture, on urban development, is not taking seriously, or are not taking seriously, the scientific advancements of society, and mostly Western science. And then the governments are not using science for solving that problems or those problems. And so, in certain way, scientists are feeling like a forgotten tribe as well, like something, we are useless. Saying, well, we are providing satellite imagery, we are providing models, mathematical models, we are providing plenty of narrative for biodiversity protection, and the governments are not taking that into account. So it doesn't matter if we hold a PhD or if we are shamans of whatever culture, because the governments and the politicians are not hearing. So there's a common ground in terms of political agreements that can be built and that are being built, because plenty of knowledge holders, indigenous experts, and all sorts of intellectual persons are participating in that discussion. And those are kind of and I insist, of the questions that are being discussed during the couple of those years, couple of years. So, main questions: how knowledge, say, about biodiversity and ecosystems is acquired in other cultures. This is a very complex question especially for biodiversity, because biodiversity is such a local thing. It's really very unevenly distributed throughout the surface of the world. You have also ocean biodiversity, which is not really in the minds of people that lives in the mountains, and the opposite is true as well. People from the rainforest that have kind of a very different environment than those that live in savannas or that live in the boreal taigas. So is that kind of a settlement of position affecting the ways that we acquire knowledge? And to what extent our minds are framed by the local experience of living with non-human animals, but different non-human animals. And so to hear about metamorphosis and about the way we think and we talk with animals is quite important here, because it's how our minds are framed within that. So question is that can we talk about living the same reality, and to what extent we may share that? And if you ask that to the governments, of course, they have a very, very narrow view. The world is just one world. And say, are we really into one world? And if you ask that to the Ministry of the Environment of my country, Colombia, or whoever is in charge of decisions, everybody would say the same. Of course, we live in one world and we share the same world. I don't know. Such as I bring the case of ayahuasca and yahe, that's a substance, a plant that is brought to the young people of the many tribes in the Amazon, and it changes perception, it changes physiology, it changes everything. So when you talk with a person that has been trained by ayahuasca, you are talking to a person that is quite different than yourself. Its experience, but its brain, it's completely modeled in a different way. So even if you can talk to him or her, you know that there's a different set of mind, and you have to get acquainted to that difference. But of course, that difference of experiences and bodies is common to the historical differences between ethnicity, between gender, and whatever type of historical experience you have. Then you have the question about values and rights. That types of knowledge, those systems of knowledge that have been acquired in a very different processes and a very different type of story, what kind of values promote, what kind of attachment to the land, what kind of kinships do they develop, and what kind of dialogues they create with nature. And then it emerged the idea of Mother Earth, or there's plenty of ways of thinking or detaching from the organic nature of the world. And then you have the process, the adaptation process of the different societies, and knowledge as a way of adapting, but also as a way of innovating the ways of living in the world. Because it's not, adaptation doesn't mean, doesn't follow a deterministic pattern, of course, we already learned that. So, cultures really embed nature within their languages, within their ways of living, within their practices, and cannot be detached from them. They're really, really grounded. And this, again, has lots of problems for scientific management of the world, because you need to objectify nature, you need to take decisions about wildlife, and for that you need a level of detachment of people from that wildlife. And it's happening. In every conference around the world those days, you see the discussion of people that claims rights and people that claims a particular type of relation towards an element of nature, and how the idea of management is breaking those ties. And some types that are problematic, such as those of the Japanese fishermen of whales. Then you see, well, that we shouldn't be fishing whales, we shouldn't be killing whales, but this is something that evolved throughout centuries. It's part of the practices of the Japanese fishermen. It's disgusting to us, or to some of us. Why? Because it's against our views of life. It's because we love and have a special attachment to whales. I never touch a whale. I've never, I've seen whales quite far away. And so then Japanese say, well, but you really do nasty things to cows. Yeah, you keep cows and pigs in a very dark and ugly places, and then you sacrifice them and make lots of unhealthy food. So, well, that's plenty of conflicts here. But in that discussion, we really try to negotiate some common acceptance of behaviors that at least have importance at the local level and affect the common lands or common waters or common resources worldwide. And see? So there's what we are doing at the IPBES is to ask for as many examples as we can about the origin of roles, rights, and duties toward nature, and to try to assemble a global view of what of those are really, really local, are really affecting a specific portion of biodiversity, such as endemic species, such as places that are just present in that part of the world, and then aggregate some of them to get to the level of ecosystem functioning, biomes, and the global biota, which is an exercise that makes plenty of generalizations and sacrifices, but what we want to do is to emphasize functions and connectivity throughout scales. Of course, for each of the cases, we have to be very careful about narratives and about the ways those livelihoods and those systems of knowledge are built. But you know, those international platforms usually work just with scientific instruments, Western science instruments, such as maps, such as mathematical models, I insist, and computers. And then there's plenty of knowledge that doesn't flow into the platform, that doesn't flow into the discussions. So there's lots of discussion on how are we going to make visible the knowledge that is not written, that is not in a I say, traditional way for the modern science on our side. And this is still an ongoing problem because should we build databases and ask the hundreds or thousands of local people to provide information about their species, their ecosystems? There are many people that thinks that we should do that way, to assemble a new type of mega and universal database about the animals and beings of the world accordingly the many traditions. And this is the example of most of the ethno-taxonomic research that has been done by scientists during the last 50 years. So, and then you get armadillos somewhere, but armadillos are present in 80 types of cultures, are eaten in some. You have recipes, or you have prescriptions, or you have health concerns, or you have beliefs about armadillos. There are the cousins, such as tapirs. They are the brothers-in-law. You have to behave in a certain way or not. So the world is really expanded when you get to that point. And then, of course, bioinformatics is thrilled. Okay, we have to assemble the universal, multicultural database about species and ecosystems, which I don't think is the way to go, of course. Then, for IPBES, of course, it's very important to see how those systems of knowledge evolve, who speaks on their behalf, and what kind of institutions are built based on those, on that knowledge, and who represents that institutions. Do shamans are the people we have to talk with, or are they jaguar cousins? Do we invite more social scientists, which is a claim that I've heard all the time, or we do invite more women? You know, women are a different species for some people, so let's bring them more gender equity within IPBES, just because it will be they will bring lots of new types of knowledge. So do we bring people from FAO, from UNESCO, or from universities, or from WWF, or from local fishermen associations, or from the private sector? And you know that nowadays everybody's bringing people from the industry, from the enterprises, for decisions about biodiversity and ecosystem services, and economics of biodiversity is now becoming more and more frequent in such terms. But still we struggle. This slide should have been a bit previously, but 5 minutes, okay. When IPBES and the scientific community that is engaged into this work is talking about biodiversity, again, are we talking about the same thing? Are we talking about the same, the focus on species and ecosystems, or are we talking about functions and relations between animals, plants, water, land, and ourselves? What's the type of relations on the issues that arise for urban dwellers? Now 50% of humanity is living in cities, and their experience towards non-human species is quite different. It's heavily mediated, it's elaborated throughout the museums, it's elaborated throughout the science for kids facilities that are wonderful in our cities. But what about a real experience, a direct experience? You have experiences of biodiversity just in the national parks, which is also a trend, or what other types of relations you have to take into account. There's plenty of discussions about rights of eating things, or using things, or protecting things. And there's a big conference of the world, which is the CITES. I don't know if you are aware of that. The CITES is the trade regulator for wildlife. Do we sell or buy whatever, sharks or palms, and what purposes for? Of course, in the issue of capacity building, what we have to analyze, the narratives of biodiversity, how are they being transmitted? How are they being elaborated? Who is doing such mediation, and how? Are the indigenous and local communities participating really in the process of elaborating and bringing those narratives towards the governments? Are governments protecting, promoting the discussion of local communities' engagement into the build-up of new knowledge, or the assembling of different types of knowledge? And there's more questions about that. The issue of innovation, which is quite complicated, tradition versus innovation. Are local and indigenous communities really innovating in their approaches, or they are just repeating traits? And when we go to the issue of extinction, cultural extinction, are we just trying to preserve practices that we think are sustainable? We are discussing with other cultures in our terms, or what they want to do in the current situation that they are confronting. And so to finish, it's what and where are the policies that are emerging for promoting different knowledge systems and promoting their evolution and their engagement into the task of saving the biodiversity or saving life on Earth, because that's what we are risking to lose. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here and for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. It's been a fantastic conference. Can you hear me? Am I speaking well enough into the microphone? All right, so we'll keep this position without changing it for the next 30 minutes, exactly 30 minutes. The production of audiovisual images of indigenous people in Brazil has followed an extractive logic. According to this logic, photographers and filmmakers journeyed far to the Brazilian interior to record images of indigenous groups, and images that tended to be viewed, circulated, valued, archived only in metropolitan regions, away from the places in which they were taken. That reminds me of the film we saw, in which one of the most interesting parts is the photography development in a river, which is a very rare moment, right? Sort of this moment of seeing the ethnographic print with your ethnographic object, which in that film gets turned around, right? Who is the ethnographic object or subject there? This motto holds true for a wide array of emblematic examples of documentary filmmaking, from the pioneer work of Thomas Hayes in Brazil in the early teens and 20s, who traveled with Rondon, basically mapping the Amazon, the many filmmakers who traveled with the Vilas Boas brothers, the most important explorers during the mid-century in Brazil, all the way to the present, even filmmakers as well-known as Werner Herzog, and I'm thinking here of 10,000 Years Older, a short film by him. These expeditions were also perceived as time travels of sorts, as journeys towards the past represented by Stone Age Indians. Focused on contact stories, ethnographic documentaries constitute an archive obsessed with origins, with primal scenes of encounter, and with inscriptions of people cast by an ethnocentric gaze as primitive and archaic, remainders of a past destined to vanish. I start with these references to such well-known ethnocentric tropes, which we have also been hearing from other speakers, so as to provide a context for the intervention performed by Vídeo nas Aldeias, to which I'll refer as VNA for the rest of this talk, Video in the Villages, the cooperative founded in 1986 by photographer and activist Vincent Carelli. During the last 3 decades, the VNA has worked to make video technology available to indigenous groups, to various indigenous groups. Initially, as the approach was to simply offer video to communities and to document whatever they wished, which could include meetings, political discussions, rituals and celebrations, forms of knowledge that were perceived to be in danger of being lost, etc. The tapes produced by this group would remain with the communities. And the films that were made were somehow a second thought, an afterthought. However, they were essential because it was in this way that the project could be funded. So initially, the films that were made and circulated were simply a form of collecting, of securing funding for the project. After 1997, however, it morphed into a school of cinema and has been producing some of the most interesting filmmakers in Brazil today, such as Ariel Duarte Ortega, who is Guarani, the Ashaninka Isaac Pinhata, and the Chavante Divino de Serwahu, just to name a few. The VNA was initially inspired by a gesture of reorientation of the ethnographic archive. In the early 80s, Carelli worked as an archivist compiling photographs of indigenous people for a project called Povos Indígenas do Brasil, which resulted in a number of books with articles and photographs released during the 1980s. As Carelli recalls, what excited him in this project was not the act of finding and collecting historical photographs, but the possibility of offering those images to the communities from which they were taken in the first place. It was seeing the response of people to the images of their communities that inspired him to form the V&A. The return of the image then, with associated connotations such as other forms of return, repatriation, recovery, and even the reverse shot, constitute the V&A's founding gesture and informs the group's entire body of work. In effect, the V&A attempts to invert the extractive logic of ethnographic image making and create in its place reparative forms of audiovisual mediation. Images here are not meant to be archival records, not meant to be added to a monumental collection, but rather are meant to be put to use, to have some kind of utilitarian purpose for the continuity of indigeneity. In this paper, I'm going to elaborate on these thoughts by focusing on the group's first work, Carelli's 1987 video, A Festa da Moça, or the Girl Celebration, which is an experiment with the Nambiquara Indians. And I will think of this film in relation to kind of the Nambiquara's history, both in film and in writing. And I'll conclude by choosing just one contemporary film to further think of this question, though many could be chosen, and I'll talk about that towards the end, which will be Divino Tseruahu's 2009 film, Mulheres Chavante Sem Nome, The Nameless Chavante Women. A Festa da Moça offers a potent illustration of the use of video as an instrument of reparative mediation. This is a rough-hewn work made at a time when Carelli was new to video production, and this is in part why it is rarely examined. It's often mentioned, but rarely discussed in depth. Made at the request of the Nambiquara leaders, the video's point of departure was a documentation of a coming-of-age ritual for teenage girls, a celebration that brought together neighboring Nambiquara groups tied by intermarriage. As we learned from the video, the Nambiquara girls at the center of the celebration spend several weeks in seclusion in a hut built specially for this purpose. The period of isolation ends when the neighboring Nambiquara groups gather in the host village and participate in the girls' coming out by dismantling the hut that hides them, in an act that in part signifies their availability as wives for these intermarrying communities. After the festivities were filmed, the village gathered to watch the video, and we see this footage as well. The excitement followed by the Nambiquara responded with a mixture of excitement and disappointment to the footage. The excitement followed from the sheer novelty of seeing themselves on the screen, perhaps the excitement of being not only the objects, but also the subjects of viewing these images, and they have been documented many times along the 20th century, so that was kind of a novelty at that point. The disappointment, however, resulted from the fact that their performance, rendered as recorded image, rendered visible in that way, fell short of their expectations. It seemed impoverished by a collective lack of attention to detail that only became glaring to them in that experience. And thus they requested that they be filmed again. They desired to reperform the celebration and improve it on a second repetition. The video provides a rather neat inversion of ethnography's extractive salvaging logic. This inversion starts with the fact that the images recorded are promptly made available and viewed by the people filmed. The temporality of video, related to the technologically specific quality of the medium, is of central importance in this regard. Because celluloid film must be developed before it can be viewed, and because this typically happens in laboratories in metropolitan areas, film technology lends itself by necessity to an extractive logic. Images are in effect taken away from the present, hidden from view, and only revealed again later at a different location. None of these conditions apply to video. The medium's novelty in relation to film consists precisely in the possibility of immediate access to the recorded image, a characteristic that Rosalind Krauss has related in a landmark essay to the rise of the aesthetics of narcissism. Artists, Krauss argues, seized on the medium for its mirror-like capacity to immediately return one's own image to oneself. Taking a slightly different track, Raymond Bellour relates video to the desire to fully possess the image. That is, the desire to rewind, slow down, pause, and immediately rewatch what is recorded. In the example of a festa, the Nambiquara indeed appear to possess and to become possessed by their images. They behold their videographic reflection with narcissistic attention and become engaged in the process of producing improved versions of themselves. In this context of video production, yet this context of video production resignifies the effects of video in ways unforeseen by either Krauss or Bellour. In contrast to metropolitan artists who embraced video from the 1970s onward, the Nambiquara's immediate engagement with their image is a welcome shift away from the extractive patterns that had informed production of images before that point. Video's immediacy is therefore uniquely suited for a paradigm shift from extractive to reparative, and in line with the desire that informs Carelli's and much of the V&A's work. So of course, the video also, even though it becomes an archival object, it's not archival in the same way as film would be, right? For this immediate return, it's also a terrible archival object. It tends to deteriorate rather quickly. So in this moment, it seems like the idea of the ethnographic archive is being questioned while these films are being made, and I'll return to this briefly. Building on the reparative return of the image to those imaged, the film reports that the interaction between this indigenous group and the recorded video helped to instigate a cultural revival that included but went beyond this coming of age of ceremony. The Nambiquara also reinstated a lip and nose piercing ceremony that had fallen into disuse for over 2 decades. The video's final shots show youth and children standing by a waterfall being pierced as the narrator states that each Nambiquara, quote, demanded that the image of his piercing be recorded. The Nambiquara man leading the ceremony also adds, quote, without such lip, ear, and nose adornments, you won't be able to prove that you are an Indian. You see what I mean? An Indian must be Indian forever, end quote. These words concluding the film imply the need to prove one's Indianness, a need that seeks a double authentication, one through the inscription on skin and flesh in the form of piercings, and another in the videographic record being produced, imagined as a sort of authenticating document. This need for proof may reflect the fact that Indians who attempt to claim rights as Indians have often been accused by the dominant society of not being Indian enough. Brazilians who make the, quote, too much land for too few Indians, end quote, argument, point recurrently to those who deviate from tradition, that is, from seeming markers of Indianness, as hucksters out to bleed the state. The reaffirmation of these external markers of authenticity, then, can be understood as a tactical response to outside pressures, a compliance to the need to place the authenticity of one's Indianness beyond dispute. But the reaffirmation may also reflect the group's own sense of identity and the needs of the community at that particular moment of cultural revival. Be that as it may, the reinstating of tradition here is akin to a return to origins that echoes the trope of ethnographic image making, but renders it as a form of recovery protagonized by the Nambiquara, who were, during that same period, incidentally also fighting for land rights and in fact, gaining land rights. So there's a political dimension to this historic moment as well. So a festa is centered on a generative encounter between living and body indigeneity and its recorded image. Video technology, the video suggests, has the potential to be a catalyst for the reanimation of cultural practices and of forms of knowledge that have gone dormant or that are on their way to disappearing. Writing years after the release of the video, Carelli recalls this as a formative event that was akin to a collective delirium, un delirio collettivo, the delirium of the Nambiquara in reaction to their first interaction with their video image, and the delirium of the V&A crew and of Carelli at the Nambiquara's video-inspired cultural revival. Far from the extractive logic, the film is invested in the immediate return of the image, a reverse shot that generates a response and even forms a symbiotic circuit between the videographic record and embodied life. The Nambiquara's encounter with their image, narrated and shown by the video, evokes and reworks their history of contact. like other V&A films from the project's early years, Festa starts with the narrator recounting a familiar contact history that, although not one of inevitable loss, is one of undeniable hardship. At the beginning of the century, the narrator says, the Nambiquara numbered more than 10,000. Today, they're fewer than 600. But she goes on then to explain the many ways in which they're recovering their territory and the population has begun to grow. There is also a notable history of contact expeditions and archival records about the Nambiquara that the film evokes and resignifies without directly citing. For instance, the Nambiquara were filmed by Thomas Hayes. So Thomas Hayes is a pioneer figure in Brazilian ethnographic filmmaking. He bought his first camera the same year that Robert Flaherty bought his first camera. There's kind of a parallel between these two filmmakers. Of course, he never made Nanook of the North. His films were much more observational, but it's kind of has been recovered as sort of this founding figure for ethnographic film, which is a tradition which I'm not defending here, by the way. It's just kind of an important reference point. So the Nambiquara were filmed by him during the first and second decades, the second decade of the 20th century, in images that were included later in his 1932 feature film, Ao Redor do Brasil. We see images from the film here, the Nambiquara represented, and the way in which they are shown is very subtly, it's organized as a kind of evolution towards a de-Indianization. He shows images of them in the nude and with the markers of authenticity. It describes them as being still hostile to visitors, and then gradually shows them wearing, non-Biquara clothing, and then with farming implements, farming in a way that suggests more of a rural peasant farming rather than indigenous, and culminating in the fact that one of the Nambiquara women married the representative of the state who happens to be working in this particular center. So there's kind of a gradual, very benignly cast idea of disappearance in this film that echoes the official policy at the time, or the official discourse at the time, which was this sort of benign disappearance of the Indian. This sort of the Indian would become just a peasant, ultimately, in this logic. How am I doing with time? Because I think I might have to jump some.
We have maybe 10 to 15 minutes.
Let's see. I think I'm going to abbreviate some parts. This is a part of a much bigger paper. I want to touch on one other important reference point that is evoked by Carelli's film with the Nambiquara, and that is Claude Lévi-Strauss' Trees Tropiques, of which a very important chapter is on Nambiquara. Incidentally, Lévi-Strauss traveled to search for them at a time when the Nambiquara had been having contact since the 1700s, but at the time that Lévi-Strauss goes to seek them out, they're still perceived as being isolated. They're not perceived as being in regular contact with the nation. And he follows on Rondon's footsteps, because Rondon laid out the telegraph line to the Amazon, and that was the 1907 contact with Nambiquara. He follows on the telegraph line and follows, Lévi-Strauss consciously he tells you he's following in the footsteps of previous travelers. And he goes to see the Nambiquara, and there is a very important chapter in Lévi-Strauss' book called The Writing Lesson. That I think is a reference point important for what Carelli does in '87. In the writing lesson, I think many of you probably have read this. In writing lesson, Lévi-Strauss goes to Nambiquara, distributes pencil and paper, which apparently is something he often did in his field expeditions, just to see what they would do. And he comments that Nambiquara were actually not only a non-literate society, but they were very uninterested in drawing. The idea of inscribing altogether seemed uninteresting to them. Nevertheless, they started scribbling on the notebook much as he was writing. So he makes much of this imitation, this scene of repetition between his act of writing and their act of pretend writing, which gets carried over particularly by the Nambiquara chief, who not only scribbles lines, but pretends to read them. So there's a very important scene in that chapter in which there's a moment of exchange of gifts, and it's a tense meeting of various Nambiquara groups from Lévi-Strauss' perspective, and the chief pretends that he's reading from a text, who gets what gifts. So he appropriates the writing technology in a kind of theatrics of reading to distribute these gifts to the Nambiquara. And Lévi-Strauss is freaked out in this moment in the book because he understands that act as a power grab, as a way of saying, look, I know the code, I know the technology of the white traveler. So he starts reading this as the other leaders gathered there are now feeling antagonistic towards him and anything could go wrong. Nothing happens. He barely escapes. Of course, Lévi-Strauss gets lost. His camera almost gets lost in his story. But he mentions that he casts this story as a sort of replacement of first contact. First contact is usually a myth, but here is the first contact with writing. So he claims to have introduced the Nambiquara to the technology of writing, and that introduction was kind of a violent pedagogy. It was it precipitated some kind of negative outcome, which he describes by the fact that after he left, the Nambiquara leader was abandoned by his people. Quote, the villagers who withdrew their allegiance to their chief after he had tried to exploit a feature of civilization felt in some obscure way that writing and deceit had penetrated in their midst. And they went off into some remote area of the bush to allow themselves a period of respite. So he casts this story, which of course produces an important lesson to him, an important piece of writing for the thought about writing in the West, as obviously a loss to the Nambiquara. And why is this significant? I think it's obvious, right? So Carelli comes in 1987, and he again replaces this idea of the contact, in which video now becomes the object. No longer is writing. It is no longer contact as white and indigenous, it's contact with video. So unlike Lévi-Strauss, in Carelli's casting, right, far from being a corrupting foreign influence, video serves to help them thrive and reaffirm their identity. Mimetic repetitions, which is an important idea of mimetic repetitions, is crucial here as well in this contact zone, right? The sort of Lévi-Strauss writes, the Nambiquara write, right? This kind of narrative, there are hundreds of versions of it, right? Is what Michael Taussig discusses in Mimesis and Alterity, for instance. And they're actually really important examples. For instance, the way in Caminha's letter, right? The founding document of Brazil, 1500 letter to the Portuguese king, in which the climax moment is the first mass in Brazil. And the Indians were gathered there, knelt like the Portuguese, stood like the Portuguese, performed physically, imitated the Portuguese. Again, a benign kind of casting in Caminha's letter, but that foreshadows the sort of writing on the indigenous body. It's sort of like, it's a blank slate. It's ready for being converted, for being written on. So in Carelli's video, I'm arguing, mimetic repetitions of gestures appear in this contact zone, but here the indigenous body does not imitate the metropolitan traveler. Rather, they appear to imitate themselves, becoming, as it were, energized by their own mediated image to perform indigeneity. We're talking about doubles, really, ultimately, about various possibilities of doubles coming face to face, and here the double is the videographic image. Now, there is no doubt that what is archived in the VNA's inaugural work is not only the story of a video experiment with the Nambiquara, but also the indigenists' anxieties and hopes, especially as they relate to intercultural contact and the production of ethnographic images. Carelli's video was made at a moment when ethnographic authority was undermined by the critiques of activists and scholars and the increasing self-affirmation of indigenous groups. Also at that time, the history of contact expeditions became widely understood to amount to a series of massive disasters. In 1987, the same year that Carelli made his video, the Coordenadoria Geral dos Índios Isolados, the coordinating body of the state of isolated Indians, proposed that national policy should be to never contact isolated groups again. The new policy of the state, which was decided in 87, was to prevent contact at all costs, unless indigenous people sought contact. So it was the end of an imaginary of the search for first contacts, just at this point when Carelli starts the project. This policy, of course, of no contact doesn't apply to the Namiquara, who had a long history of interactions, but reflected the troubled recapitulation of indigenists regarding their capacity to intervene positively in contact situations. In a context marked by hopelessness and loss of authority, Carelli's video recasts the primal scene redemptively by giving a special place to video as a medium. In so doing, he articulates at once a pro-Indian project of intercultural contact and a reoriented project of ethnographic representation. So in pointing out that a festa is not only about the Namiquara, but about anxieties of the indigenous, I don't mean to dismiss completely the video or Carelli's work, which is remarkable. This is just one little piece of work. He does an amazing body of work. But I want to point out that the VNA's work, that this 30-year project of video in the villages, is largely about video. Is in a sense not, the protagonist is in a sense not really the indigenous or the Indians who play various roles, but initially is video itself. That's kind of the hero of the story. That's what is saved, in a sense, more than Namiquara in his initial project. What is interesting is that for the following decades, we can see how this initial trope, another sort of inaugural trope, another sort of first contact, gets revisited, recast, critiqued, appropriated by various figures, including indigenous filmmakers. I could take many different paths on this paper now because the chapter that it's from discusses several films that in different ways reject or transform this initial proposition. Can we say 10 or 8? Well then. Okay, good. So what I'm going to do here then is talk about Divino Tseruahu's film. Let's see, I'll jump a little bit here. So Tseruahu's film is evocative of a festa in many ways. The film also revolves around a celebration in which young indigenous women undergo an initiation, a process through which they receive a new name. This important festival, Divino tells in voiceover, has disappeared in all 165 existing Xavante groups except his own, where it was last performed in 1994, when it was filmed by Vincent Carelli. Since then, the Xavante have attempted to celebrate the festival several times, prodded by community elders as well as by Divino, whose motives become clear only later. Divino's film alters the relationship between performed indigeneity and videographic record that is established by a festa. Here, the filmic records of past celebrations are retrieved and consciously used in a failed attempt to reignite performance in the present. While in Carelli's video, interaction with the image results in a symbiotic circuit between corporeal and the recorded, in Mulheres Xavante, the archival image of the celebration viewed on multiple occasions by the community, inspires thought, amusement, debate, and reflection, but fails to animate performance. The archival records are a recurring topic in the film. So we see here Divino, you see there, Divino retrieving various tapes of previously recorded performances. This is the 1994 record that Vincent Carelli produced. He also locates the records of an earlier filmed performance from 1967, featuring a generation of Xavante who are currently the community's elders. At the moment when they decided, so in the 1950s, the Xavante were defeated by the state ultimately, and in what at the moment was a tactical surrender, went into the Salesian mission, seeking asylum to recover. And it's those people that are represented in 67 footage. So it's sort of a very important original moment for this Xavante group. Divino shows the film to the community. Here we see the scenes of them viewing it, and we hear the Xavante commenting things like, it's good, it's unique, it's the original recording, it's the real thing. That's why there's no sound, one man says, conflating the marker of an older technology with the authenticity of performance at an earlier Chavante historical moment. This viewing of the images is a prelude to a scene in which Divino speaks of his urgency to have the festival performed. He has received funding to make this film, and is running out of time. So he says, we got at least do part of the celebration, anything with which I can make a film and comply. Some of the Chavante are ready to start. The festival has to be exactly like the one we saw in the movie, one of them says. And yet, as they attempt to do it, it doesn't come together. There are several reasons why it doesn't happen. Over the years, there are several accidents that interrupt it, but in this particular instance, Divino realizes that the community cannot agree on whether it should be performed at all or not. So the film becomes, as he says, about a festival that's no longer performed, and an investigation of that event. I'm going to summarize a little bit of this before coming to the conclusion. So Divino starts to do a sort of a dialogue of the community, often around this archival footage, and what becomes evident is that this festival involves sex. To what extent is not clear, because people disagree on whether sex is central, marginal, really important, not important. But these are Chavante that have been living in a Salesian community for decades, and for whom the celebration no longer means the same thing that it meant before. So many of the people in the community are overtly against it. And that starts to become clear as he asks them about the festival. Any doubts about the place of intercourse in this festival, of sex in this festival, is dispelled when we learn that Divino was himself conceived during the festival of 1973. While viewing the archival images of the celebration with Tiago Torres, who participates in the film, at the V&A office, Divino recalls that he learned as an adolescent that the exceptional affection shown to him by another Chavante family resulted from the fact that his biological father is not his mother's husband, but a man with whom she had sex during the 1973 festival. It's as if he was your mother's second husband, Divino's father explained to him. Divino's investment in having the festival performed and filmed once again is related to his origins. In fact, it is related to many quests for origins. The origins of the recovery of the archival footage, the desire to perform a traditional celebration that has fallen into disuse, Divino's obsession with the festival because of the fact that he's biologically linked to it, but also because his cinematic initiation, his first film experience, was filmed the festival in 1994. So it's sort of a return to origins to him in a number of ways. Placed in contrast with the V&A's inaugural film, Mulheres Chavante offers a thoughtful meditation about the interaction between the corporeal and the videographic. In Carelli's video, the space and difference between body and image, or between performance and archival record, disappear in the immediacy of the return of the videographic image. Mulheres Chavantes, on the other hand, dwells precisely on the interstitial space separating living bodies from recorded image. This becomes especially interesting in a scene in which his uncle comes into a building where they are going to look at archival footage of the 67 festival. So he comes, he says, "Uncle, is that you?" Showing the footage of him in full-fledged performance. "Yes, that's me. Traditionally dressed and holding a rattle, seeming ready to start the festival at a moment's notice, the older Chavante looks intently at the image of his younger self mid-performance. Other screens come into view here as well, such as two large monitors, one of which shows a list of digitalized files of indigenous performances, an ethnographic archive that Divino and the Chavante now possess and revisit at will. The setting is crucial. They are in the village's Museu Comunitário e Centro de Cultura Chavante, built in 2005. This scene in the modest community museum shows the way in which the community relates to the objects of their culture, but also to their culture as objects. The museum's circular room contains display cases along its perimeter that holds artifacts, the glass between viewer and object functioning much like another screen. These things are meant to be seen and contemplated rather than used. At the center of this building, which emulates the shape of a traditional Chavanchi house, but is made of masonry, there is a traditional Chavanchi house, another object on display. This scene shows the Chavanchi as the archivists of their own culture, a culture that becomes a self-conscious possession that is reflected about and selectively handled and deployed. Divino's point here is not to mourn a loss of primal innocence, but to explore the experience of indigeneity that tends to cultural memory while acknowledging the impossibility of returns, or at least of full returns to origins. He handles authenticity with irony as well, as if putting it in quotes. This becomes clear when in one scene he instructs his uncle to remove all non-traditional items from the view of the camera before he conducts an interview. Thus the traditional image of the Chavanchi is presented as an effective mise-en-scène. Far from the proof of authenticity of the Nambiquara and their recorded lip-piercing ceremony, video here records a sense of indigeneity that is lived as interrogations, approximations, constructions, and change. The reparative power of video is greatly reduced, and the film even strives to show its incapacity to animate performance. Video technology, however, remains the protagonist, or at least an ally, of a reflexive indigenous self. So I hope you don't go too far over time. This one example that suggests some closures of possibility is only one example of many other possibilities that we can find with several different groups in Brazil, the Equipeng, the Chavanchi, who basically reflect about this legacy of video in the villages in very different ways. Well, thank you very much.
So to the organizers, do you want to really end at 5, or is that just a goal? It's a fluid goal. Okay, good. So, because I don't, I'm not organized, I'm just doing it. So I want to thank the two panelists for their wonderful presentations, and again, the organizers of this, can you hear me? Is that good enough, loud enough? Of the organizers of this event for inviting me to be here today. I guess the only legitimacy is that when I traveled the first time to Latin America, or the second time to Latin America, I lived in Bogota for 6 months, and then traveled to Leticia, and then went across to Benjamin Constanti and traveled down the Solimões, and imagined what might have been out there in the wildernesses and the peoples that might occupy that part of the Amazon. And the first big city that I came to in Brazil was Tabatinga, which I ask any Brazilian if they know where it is, and they have no idea where it is. But it now has a federal university, but it was a very tiny village in 1976. And that speaks to the recent government's policies to expand higher education to areas that were not serviced in previous governments. And I'm going to get back to that theme in a certain way at the end. So the title of this conference, Unearthing the South, Indigeneity, Globality, and Community, suggests digging, going deeper, discovering the South through the lenses of indigeneity, globality, and community. So how do we do it differently than the generations of scholars from the global North who have gazed on the global South in a way that does not reproduce the knowledge and hierarchies of power that we're all very aware of in terms of the problems that they are embedded in them. So I think Bridget in her presentation points to the fact that, or this conference points to the fact that interdisciplinarity or intersectionality, as they love to say in Brazil, are ways in which people from history, from literature, from the social sciences, and now with the scientists can perhaps have a dialogue to have a better understanding of the reality of the peoples that occupy the Americas, and in this conference it seems more the Amazon River Basin. And then also, this is a big challenge because we don't do a good job in academia yet of having a good, successful conversation between people in the sciences who understand part of the reality of the Amazon, to give the example, and people in the social sciences and literature and history. And so I think that Bridget's presentation kind of points us into that direction of having that dialogue with something that the Brazilian Studies Association has tried to do as a whole, and Brown very specifically, with lots of uneven results because of very, very different agendas. And what strikes me as very interesting at Bridget's presentation is it really points to questions of policy, which is something that most of us are not supposed to talk about. We're supposed to talk about the past, we're supposed to talk about cultural creations, but not really implement some political agenda behind that, which I liked in terms of kind of having that as a tension in this discussion. And in that regard, I just wanted to make a small comment, which is metadatabases seem to be a wonderful way of collecting this knowledge and information, whether it's done by indigenous peoples or by NGOs. But the question is really who owns and has power over those metadatabases. I'm sure the pharmaceutical industry is very interested in many people doing that wonderful work for them in order to then copyright through some legal procedure traditional knowledge and take it in a different direction where perhaps we want it to be. And I think of this a lot now because even though I work on 20th century Brazilian history, gender, sexuality, and the military dictatorship, I've been blessed to have Hugo Lusitante here at Brown University, someone you met last night. I couldn't be at the event. I wish I could have been here, and he regrets that he can't be here today because he's suffering from a cold. But really discussing with him in depth what it means to not only be at an... Hugo is the first, that I'm aware of, is the first person whose first language is an indigenous language, who's at an Ivy League university studying, you know, and the implications of that for his life, for the life of his community, and for the knowledge that he is learning and is being produced, and what we do to produce knowledge about the Kofan and their language, Ainge, to preserve them. And how does that work in this whole complex world of narrations of decline and acculturation and extinction? And so I was really, Heather's work really, I thought a lot about that, because if there has been a narrative of decline and extinction in the past, is it not really today the time in which we can say this truly is a narrative that is not a trope, but it's reflecting a reality? Gustavo talks about tools that are used, and I confess I didn't get a chance to read your paper beforehand. Would have loved to have read it, but I didn't get it. And so I'm not clear, are the indigenous peoples making the video films? But then Carelli is doing documentaries on that to get the funding. So
in the first 87 to 97, it was predominantly non-indigenous people making the films at the request of indigenous people. But then at that point, it morphs into more of a school of cinema, and what you have from that point on, Carelli continues to make documentary films with indigenous people. But what you have from that point on is indigenous filmmakers more and more making their own films. And
editing it and distributing it and getting it into film festivals.
Distribution usually goes through Visions of the Year. So
okay, so
like
right.
a lot of the apparatus for the global reach happens through the NGO.
So in a lot of ways, this is an attempt to kind of counter the overall hierarchies of the North over the South and all of their manifestations, and how that map can be turned upside down, that famous map of the world that we flip up and say, well, what does that tell us about the relations of power in the world? One attempt being giving the power of filming to indigenous people, and then eventually so that they can control how they want to record themselves and have control over that information. It's not just a symbolic bringing back for you to see, but it's also giving you power. And I think that Bridget's presentation suggests this in terms of the power of NGOs trying to intervene in a different way in dealing with questions of the environment and indigeneity and participation to kind of flip those relations of power. And I think because this is something that suggests policy or politics or the present, I wanted to just ask the question, you know, what are the limitations of these tools? What are the ways in which they can really achieve the goals that they set out to achieve, or whether they're part of a constantly frustrated inability to reverse power relations and reverse trends? And I think of this especially within the context of where we're living in this moment, in this country, in Colombia, in Brazil, and in Latin America, and perhaps in other parts of the world, Europe and Eastern Europe, in which a real strong wave of right-wing reaction and all of its implications are dominating in some way or the other, and how that's shifting the possibilities. And so if we think in incredibly simplistic and broad terms, as if this is the Introduction to Latin American History, and I'm on the 60s in my lecture. If we think of the Cuban Revolution provoking both reform and radical social change in the 60s and 70s, which then provoked military regimes coming to power in many countries, and in then bargaining for the transition to democracy, neoliberalism was the trade-off for democratic rule again, and then a response to experiences of neoliberalism and privatization and deconstruction of the social welfare state, a pink and red tide flowing over certain countries in different ways in Latin America, and now again a new neoliberal wave going over many parts of Latin America and the effects on public policy. In other words, what are going to be the ways that people can truly not just give indigenous people power, but be allies in preventing extinction? And what are the ways that we can really revert the politics of the neoliberal conservative wave, which is to destroy the environment in the pursuit of profit? And I think that both of the papers kind of speak to these two challenges in different ways, and I just wanted to be provocative in that way in terms of commenting on their work. Thank you. I'm chairing, so we can take questions. And does someone have the mic that can be circulating so people can hear? Is there a mic to circulate? Want to take that one, maybe? So is there a person who wants to make a question or a comment?
I actually can start. I thought that one of the common threads that I've seen on both of your papers, but also in the conference throughout the presentations, is this anxiety, right, with one archive that is disappearing, and at the same time we are all in the university, right? We know what kind of legacy comes with this archive, right? So actually my question is for you, Brigitte, because you voiced very clearly that you don't think this meta databases is the answer, right? So I was curious what you're proposing.
Okay, that was the decision of IPES after the first year of discussion, if we were going to assemble a kind of a big database, or there's a task force on data, information, and knowledge. That's the name. And they suggested to build some kind of data archive of Noah's Ark of cultures and biodiversity. And at the end they said no, but it's not because it's difficult, it's because it's expensive. And the multilateral organisms don't have any money right now. Countries are not bringing that money, if that would be the case to follow the decision. And so the recommendation is let's get engaged into a more participatory process with global or at least regional indigenous and local communities groups, and let's promote a dialogue with them and say what they have to say about preserving their biodiversity and global biodiversity. And this is what has to be designed during the last couple of years of this part of the project of the IPBES, a participatory mechanism that at least brings the voices of the indigenous organizations and groups. And the discussion of we have done piloting for inviting indigenous knowledge holders, and we've met the team spent a couple of millions of dollars doing workshops all around the world with shamans and people and wise members of the local communities, and getting study cases. At the end, we have 40 study cases about livelihoods and biodiversity, but nothing that really gets an idea of how are those groups or communities thinking about the global change or about what has to be done different than give us some help, give us some resources for protecting our territory and our land. So now we are moving towards a more political way of acknowledging the importance of knowledge in a different level of construction. Let's see what the countries have to say in next March when this proposal is brought to the parties to build a world system of indigenous and local communities participation into biodiversity management. It's something similar is being done at the IPCC, where indigenous groups and communities are bringing some ideas and are discussing and promoting analysis of the fact of global climate change, but it's quite different for biodiversity.
Thank you for both papers. I'll ask a question to Gustavo. Gustavo, the you mentioned in Lévi-Strauss, Triste Tropics is also famous because of Derrida's analysis of it and you know, the kind of a critique of the meta-narrative and the idea that it's the beginning of the end of something. My question then is, in the case of the Vigilance Aldeias project, is there any self-critique happening within the project? And if there is a self-critique of what are we doing, are we starting a process of, I don't know, of you know, narcissism that, or is it all a celebration of the ability to keep the archive, etc.? And if there is a self-critique, you know, what form does it take? I don't know if my question is clear.
Yeah, I don't think that there is an overarching self-critique, and it's in part, I mean, if you take Carelli's own work, he is generally extremely plain-speaking. He doesn't elaborate critically his own project, so you have to do that work for him. But what you do have is various different communities and filmmakers who are inheriting this, you know, who are learning how to make films from Vigilance Aldeias people, who are being often, you know, taking possession of, for instance, films of the first contacts with their communities. First contacts always in quotes, right? The documented contact with their communities, who are, you know, taking possessions of photographs, and at the same time as you have these people that are rising filmmakers. So what you have is this very, you know, varied ways in which that legacy is appropriated, incorporated, thought about. I think that there is an obsession with origins that continues contra Derrida in this tradition, and I think that shows in Divino, even as he criticizes his own quest for origins by documenting its failure. I think the more interesting line of critique, as I see it, is that there is an almost naive faith in the archive as a savior of memory that informs the project in its origin. And a lot of indigenous chiefs, like Chief YY from the Waiapi, overtly described video as kind of the solution for death. You know, he was sort of like, it was precisely what he wanted, to not lose anything else. So there's this faith in the record, in the production of records as a savior of memory, that I think what happens gradually is, you know, okay, how is archival memory different from the memory of performance, from kinds of knowledge that are done on day to day, from imagination and recollection. So you have that dialogue developed in several films that are not, they don't have theses, right? These are often process films. They are made through participation of various peoples. So you often have, you know, archival materials juxtaposed with reenactments or with songs, and what is being I think, teased out there is the possible incompatibility between the two, as well as the places where something actually occurs. And sometimes that's even incorporated very ironically. Like there's this one film that's all about songs. And at one point, it's a great film because the woman, it's going to be a celebration, and the only one who knows all the songs, actually got sick during the making of the film. She has a fever. So there's a bit of an archive fever in this film, right? Hipermulheres. And so there's this anxiety. The film kind of is fiction and documentary. So like they explore this to explore the anxiety about loss. And there's one woman in the film who is very forgetful. And at some point she's looking for cassette tapes. She can't find them. She doesn't know where she puts them. So she finds the cassette tapes and she tries to work the tape, but the tape is a little scratchy. So like the film uses the archive to mock it in juxtaposition to songs remembered, taught with the burichi strings, with other kinds of mnemonic devices. Even though what that particular film which you saw, what is not in the film is that the making of the film was crucial for the ritual to happen, because the way that they make most V&A films, no matter who is making them, is you shoot and you show. So you have every evening you have show, and because of this, the women who knew the songs wanted to keep on doing it. So the film was a catalyst for the performance. But the finished film hides that. It only includes the archive to kind of mock it in the form. So what you have is kind of ongoing conversation, chatter about those frictions between different forms of memory.
Ruby, yeah. Undergraduate students at Brown have been a rarity at this conference. You deserve to
Hi.
speak.
Thank you. That was a really compelling and wonderful talks. And thank you all for organizing this conference. It's really interesting. I don't know if this is sounding properly.
Very proper.
So I think for me, one really important conflict when talking about indigenous communities, indigenous cultures, indigeneity today is this conflict between adaptation, appropriation, transformation, as different words have been used in the talks, of sort of traditional versus modern, traditional versus globalization, things like that. And a scene in the movie last night that was really compelling for me was the scene of the compass, where, for those of you who haven't seen it, a white explorer has been visiting with a community that he's very friendly with. Seemingly, he shows them his compass. And as he's leaving, he realizes he doesn't have it and accuses them of having stolen it. Thinks some of the boys stole it. Oh, there we go. And finds out that the chief stole it, and he's sort of fighting to get it back, and his friend who's indigenous pulls him away and tells him, just leave it, it's fine. And he says, well, their system of navigation relies on the stars, and if we take that, if we give them a compass, they'll lose that. Which is sort of a twist of what we're expecting. And then the response from his travel companion is, well, everyone has the right to knowledge. And that, to me, reflects these sort of, when we're talking about, I think there maybe is a Western desire to preserve and to hold still and record what is indigenous and we feel is important. And at the same time, the reality is that these communities largely cannot do that anymore. And I think in both of your work, this is really important. So for you, when talking about right to chop down trees, right to hunt animals that are going extinct because that's part of culture versus what the global community wants. And similarly, when you're bringing in technology, well, that's changing traditions and that's affecting communities, but sort of how do you then go about doing that in a way that is empowering and dealing with the reality that we can't keep things the way they have always been, obviously, and that as interventionists, whether we're going to study a community, whether we're writing about a community, whether we're working with the community, making policies for communities, we're having some impact and have an obligation to sort of think about what that impact is. So.
Any comments by either panelist?
I think your reflection is at the core of the decisions that we have to make for the next decades, because climate change is going to just break us all apart in every meaning. And for the conservation biology community, we have the same type of concern. That is the people that thinks that we have to stop ecological change and regain wilderness. And that's still that discussion and the status of the originality. So, we love to make collections, to put things onto alcohol and formal, and to make museums, and to create national parks, which is mimic of the biological organizations, but in many cases we don't want people in those parks. If there are indigenous people, they have to behave in certain way and to keep their indigeneity. And so that the same questions keep flourishing and coming back to us and haunting us, because IPBES is really, really trapped on that. It's trying to see to what extent do we protect whatever has to be protected, or to what extent we have to manage and provide policy for its unfolding in the next years. I don't have the answer, but I'm sure that that's the real question.
Yeah, actually, it's just a general comment on several points scattered around these presentations, which are very interesting. Again, first of all, I think that there is a difference between this obsession for origins that the Indians themselves have, and that Lévi-Strauss have by himself. So we should not mix these two things. Then I think that we should come back to the point of Derrida, because it points towards different technologies of writing, for instance, that were always present in these societies, as well as different technologies of image making. So the introduction of film is not exactly, of course it is a novelty, but it's something which is transformed or translated in previous technologies of image. That's why they really are so, how can I say, they become a sort of specialists in this kind of filmmaking, as you well know. It's amazing the solutions that they create by themselves while learning how to deal with these new instruments. And somehow I think that this points another question which we should always remind, that we're talking about one of the biggest genocides in history, it's probably not the biggest one, which means that these populations are actually the survivals, it's the survival of the destruction of their own world. They do really know how to produce archives, actually better than ours, because they survived to the destruction of their world. So I think that we should learn with them again how to produce memory, and which can be endurable to the future, not always, and also to the past, as James was talking about. I think it's a very good point. Otherwise, we don't know actually if our archives will survive to all these climate changes, but we know that somehow they are still here. So.
Merely, we saw images of archives starting with Heather all the way to Gustavo, right? And those archives will sort of include and exclude many archival practices, to the point that we have to think if archive is the word we want to use for representations of knowledge in a global setting. So we do have to think about how that global knowledge is going to look like, or in what materiality will it have, or it would be material or not. I think that it's brilliant to think of indigenous archives as being the most endurable ones that survived the biggest genocide.
Really well, right, with her notion of an archive that is not material, right? And I actually have a question to Gustavo as well about this, right? Because you quote Rosalind Krauss, and you're dealing here with the median, right? And I know that it's not the median is the message, but indeed the instantaneity of the video, right, allows for this reenaction and to escape somehow of the trap, right, of extractivism. And I wanted you to comment a little bit more on performance and how you see the video intervening or not in this power to reenact performance, because this is one point that you made in your text, right, that you were a little bit abbreviated, and I was wondering if you could tell more.
Yeah, I think that's the theme that obviously interests me most in this body of work. There's so many questions one could take, but is this dialogue. I think Diana Taylor would be a perfect way to think about this, or Paul Connerton with the idea of the inscribed and the uninscribed. I mean, of course, like I love the point that Pedro made about, you know, these are not people without archives. This is not cultures without inscription. It's just different forms. But I also like find that indigenous filmmakers too often reflect ideas of the archive that I fully share. I mean, we have like, it is not like, I feel like, for instance, there is a great scene with Divino Tseruahu, who is kind of, I feel like Divino Tseruahu could be thought of as a first-person essayistic filmmaker, in line with Andrés Di Tella and with filmmakers. Like, there's a very global sensibility to the way that he deals with indigenous questions. But there's one scene with him that he is in the Museu do Índio in Campo Grande, and he's interacting with someone standing on a floor display. It's a very interesting scene in a movie called O Mestre e o Divino. And the guy who is talking to him, it was his Salesian teacher, who is absolutely an archivist, who has like transcribed Xavante language, who, you know, made a gazillion films that are all in Germany, you know, stored in a basement. And the Salesian priest says, Divino, do you know how to make a headdress? You just make films, you know? And it's a stupid point, because he thinks of films as this non-Xavante thing, whatever, you know? But then Divino says, I know how to make it. I forgot it, but I filmed it. Right, and so there's something here that's really like kind of. I think that Divino is aware of this tension about that archiving involves forgetting, that recording, you know, is a kind of submission of memory. I think it would be really interesting to think about other kinds of memory and record keeping, especially, you know, forms of body inscription. The line that I have followed more is exactly performance. So how are stories told in different ways? So for instance, you know, if you look at Iki Peng films, especially Pirinop, My First Contact, a beautiful film in which what you have is a conversation between the remembrance of the last 4 decades by the Iki Peng in dialogue with films, mostly by French filmmakers, of the Iki Peng in the 1960s, right? So these films are like dispositifs. They're sort of like, you know, they're used to trigger another way of telling the same story. And the way the Iki Peng tell the story is mostly by singing and dancing, right? Especially the elder Iki Peng. The younger Iki Peng don't tell the story that way. They are kind of very much in between those two registers in this film, right? Seeing the Iki Peng elders literally reenacting like the arrival of the first plane after seeing the footage, and it's sort of like what you have is very different ways of remembering. Now, I don't feel like the point here is to make a conclusion, a grand conclusion about right archives or indigeneity, but I think what is interesting is that this is one of the enabling forms in which indigeneity in various locations, we're facing different problems, facing different issues of memory, articulates itself, right? Makes itself thinkable. That's the thread I'm interested in following, and the thread I follow in the longer version of this paper. And it's very much about the inscribed and the uninscribed, and the various ways in which memory can be recalled.
So I want to thank the panelists for their excellent presentations, and I'm sure that the conference organizers are going to come up to say one thing to conclude our conference today. So I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you very much. I'm very aware that I'm the only thing between everybody and a glass of wine, so I will be very brief. First of all, I want to thank all our speakers and our respondents. This has been a true joy. I think when we thought about this gathering and we were thinking about the articulating ideas behind it, you know, I will never be able to pronounce this word, interconnectedness, reciprocity, non-human agency, and perspectivism, we were really experimenting and really trying to make a bet for interdisciplinarity and fruitful dialogue that, although very focused on a particular geography, was very much broad and ambitious chronologically and interdisciplinarily. So we're, I think, very pleased with the results and look forward to the continuation of the conversation in the second floor very briefly. I would just like to share a few of the takeaway messages or tools really that I am living with after yesterday and today's sessions, and really things that I think will start informing my work, which is not particularly on the Amazon, but I think has been really enriched by some of the concepts you have shared today in your particular ways of approaching them. Well, Heather, I'm really grateful as a historian for how you really have brought anthropology and history together. I mean, your approach on grounding anthropological ethnographic findings through history has been really inspiring. I think for many of us is always a challenge, right? We are often as historians dismissed or just basically disencouraged from making connections with the present or from taking anthropological evidence as something that we could put in dialogue with the historical archive, and I'm very grateful for the way you dealt with it. It has been very inspiring. I'm also, I admire the way Pedro connected personhood and landscape and how that, through the anthropological practice became very much alive through your examples and those very immediate ways of representing that connection through your ethnographic work. Lucia, thank you for that really, true comparative literatures work, literatures in the plural, bringing those narratives in juxtaposition to the untouchable classics and making something very fruitful out of that conversation. That was also very, very inspiring, and I take it with me. The question about the authority of healing and bodies and the question of rationality in Pablo's work is also something that is very much central to my own pesquisas, to my own research, and so I'm very, again, I think with you, I know the dialogue will continue, but I think in particular around the idea of rationality and how that works and how that is a fluid concept that we can deal with historically will also be very useful. Brigitte, where's Brigitte? Here, I'm so sorry. Now, I'm tempted to now call you Brigitte the Bridge. What you're doing, trying to put in dialogue scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge in a serious way and connected to policy is, well, I think we're, ideally, I guess, many of us from academia would like to see our efforts transferred into something palpable in the actual world. And so, well, thank you for what you're doing, and I hope to continue discussing these things in the future with you. Gustavo, that paradigm shift from extractive to reparative video, well, I mean, again, coming back to the question of the archive, seeing how you deal with this as a repository of memory, of bodily memory, and of inscribed memory in ways that are certainly not traditional, but definitely as valuable and as transferable, is also very inspiring. And finally, I would just like to mention that there's another presence that we would have liked to have this afternoon, and I'm referring to Alto Krenak, an indigenous activist of the Krenak group from Minas Gerais, who we hope to have here, and due to unfortunate practicalities, could not be with us today. But I'm very grateful that through the work of Pedro, we had some of his words here today, and that was an unexpected surprise, so thank you very much for that as well. Now, finally, I would like to share with you 3 very short vignettes of geographies that we didn't cover yesterday and today in particular, but that nevertheless, I think, share some of the themes that we have discussed. And as we come to a close of our gathering, I would like to offer 3 stories of beginnings, namely 3 creation myths. Very brief ones, very vignettes really, vignette size. Not very far from here, the Iroquois have this idea that the world was created when a woman fell from the sky. And basically, the world materialized atop a turtle through the collaboration between this woman and water animals. So animals were there at the very beginning, linked in kinship with humans, a concept that is very much, I guess, uncomfortable to many of the Western minds, but is nevertheless at the very center of the ideas about interconnectedness in this region. When we go to Mesoamerica, the Maya thought that humankind was made of maize and the blood of the gods, that combination. So basically humans came out of the products of the earth quite directly and the blood of the gods. So that immediately creates, you know, a kind of a snowball of narratives about, or narratives and practices about human sacrifice that are at the very center of basically the divide between Western and non-Western cultures in terms of how we think of our humanity. When we go to the Andes, Inca creation stories retell how the creative deity Contiki fashioned humans out of great rocks, including women who were already pregnant. Think about that for a second. These are pregnant rocks, latent with life. Now, from the Western perspective, these are 3 very separate kingdoms that not only are not particularly related to each other, but are not related to humankind. But through the cosmogonies of the indigenous groups of the Americas, we see histories of connection. We have dealt with many of these yesterday and today. It has been a truly rich conversation, and as we come downstairs and start having our final discussions, I would like to invite you to think about those stories of beginnings and what they mean in terms of humanity and the rest of the natural world. Thank you, everybody, again, and I hope we keep the relationships going.